We're excited to welcome our special guest panelists who are experts in the travel and tourism industry. Without question, the pandemic really did a number on many industries, and travel and tourism was probably among the ones that were the most threatened. I don't want to use the word decimated because that's not really fair, because we're here to talk about how our experts have been able to use communication to pivot and successfully navigate the challenges that were thrown at them by the pandemic, and how they are coming out the other side stronger than ever. And so I'm really excited to introduce to you our two panelists. We have Scott Keys, who is the founder and chief flight expert at Scott's Cheap Flights. And we also have Michael Dominguez, who is president and CEO at Associated Luxury Hotels International. So we have flights and hotel. What more could you ask for here? These are two critical things for your vacation. So just to give you an idea of the format today, I will introduce our panelists, which I just did, and then I'll moderate the Q&A, where we will answer key questions that address communications best practices and strategy takeaways from one of the most impactful crises in the travel industry. And then we'll open it up to you, our audience, for our questions. So feel free to drop those questions in for the live Q&A time in advance in the chat window, or you can use the Q&A tab. I'm monitoring both of them and I will see them as they come in. So now it's time for our speakers to introduce themselves. We provided the bios in our invitations and on our website, but I'd like them to introduce themselves and tell you a little bit more about themselves. So Scott, why don't you go first?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Shay. Thank you everybody for being here, for having me. My path to becoming an entrepreneur and a startup founder was just about the opposite of what you would normally expect from a startup founder. You know, most startup founders and entrepreneurs are really kind of driven, ambitious, want to start a company, and then they're just looking for their $1 million idea. I was the complete opposite. I worked as a journalist for years. I had no intentions of ever starting a company, but I got really kind of interested in searching for flights, figuring out how the heck did people always find these cheap flights that I could never seem to get a hold of myself. And I got really good at you know, getting into this game, figuring out cheap flights, wound up finding the best deal that I've ever found in my life, which was nonstop from New York City to Milan for $130 round trip. When I got back from this trip, all my friends and coworkers kept coming up to me. Hey, Scott, I heard about that great deal you got. Hey, listen, next time you find a deal like that, can you let me know about it so I can get in on it too? And so rather than trying to remember everybody I needed to let know, I figured, why don't I start a simple little email list? And this way I can let everybody know at once. In that moment, Scott's Cheap Flights was born. But I, you know, again, was somebody who just kind of wandered into entrepreneurship and business very serendipitously. And it's just been something that has grown beyond my wildest expectations since then. Nowadays, Scott's Cheap Flights is a company with 40 people on the team, over 2 million members, and we are growing really quickly. And it's a fun time to be working in travel, especially much more fun than it has been in recent past.
Well, thank you for having me. And you know, my journey is very much a traditional path through the hotel industry, and started in this industry bussing tables when I was 15 years old, and worked with major brands, independent hotels, have worked with a convention and visitors authority as far as representing and being VP of sales for a destination. And then my last two stints were with two major luxury hotel organizations, 7 years with Lowe's Hotels, and then 7 years as the chief sales officer at MGM Resorts, which led me to the president and CEO role of ALHI, which is the Associated Luxury Hotels, and we represent the independents. We are the global sales arm for the independent hotels, just like all the brands would have a global sales team. We represent that for all of the independents. And what I love about the independent space is it's still about hospitality. The people that own and manage their own buildings, they really make decisions not based completely on the bottom line. It really is based on experience. And we talk about that a lot. And that is not at all a shot at any of the main brands that are management companies and get paid on those fees, because they do it really well. it's a different business model. That's all I'm pointing out. And I find that, when you have an independent owner, it's a pride issue when it comes to their hotel and the experience and what they deliver. And they focus on things a little bit differently. Of course, they're always looking at the bottom line, but it doesn't drive all decisions. And I couldn't agree more with Scott that I think it's an exciting opportunity. And as hard as 2020 was, it's taught all of us, or it's forced all of us to make sure we come out of this looking at things just a little bit differently in some of our business models. And I think what we found is in many cases, we become much more efficient. And it's understanding how that efficiency is going to drive it. And I will say something. You talked about pivoting. There was a young meeting planner in our industry, and she posted something on LinkedIn at one time, but she was a dancer. And she said, everybody keeps talking about pivoting. She goes, we didn't pivot. We did something called a step ball change. And in dancing, a pivot is going a completely different direction. A step ball change means I had to transfer weight from one foot to another and take a different step and go a little bit of a different direction, but I'm still headed the same way. I'm just now using a different part of my body. And I thought that was such a great thing because our industry always talks about pivot, pivot, pivot. And I thought it was a real brilliant analysis. And I knew nothing about dancing, so I actually went and looked it up. And yeah, it actually talks about that. It's a shift of the weight from one foot to another, where one was dominating and now another one will. And I really think that's a healthy way to look at where we're headed.
Well, in that vein, Michael, perhaps pivot isn't the right word. I mean, maybe I'm dating myself here, but it reminds me of that Friends episode where Ross is trying to move furniture and screaming pivot, but instead we're actually just adjusting what we have to do. So I'd like to ask both of you, and you first, Michael, how did your organization respond and adapt when COVID-19 brought travel to a screeching halt? I mean, I don't think any of us had global pandemic on our bingo card for last year.
Yeah, what's interesting, and I think the hardest thing we had to do, and I can tell you where we ended up landing, was we had to get past some of the narratives we were hearing. Because what you just said is, people thought it went from all-time records to zero. Now, that wasn't the case. It was for about a 60-day window. And then you started to see pockets of the country that were very different. And I've said this, where you sat during the pandemic very much dictates your experience and candidly some of your attitude around us even opening and what that looks like. And I'm fortunate that I live in Texas. It shocks people that I've been back in my office since May. And that in Texas, except for wearing masks and having certain capacity restrictions, things were semi-normal. And we have properties in Florida. Florida has been fully open since September. And if you go to Florida, it feels pretty normal. And this would be a surprise to people. In January, we had 1.5 million group rooms in the United States. Well, you would think no groups are happening when you hear what we hear from a narrative. So where we ended up positioning ourselves, and it became organic, we started an industry call. Right, candidly, one of the reasons I was a minute late getting on this is I just got off an industry call where I started 2 calls a week, inviting planners to them to talk about what is and what isn't. And we talked about where we are in the pandemic. We're talking about where we are in vaccination progress, talk about what's going on. And something we now have a segment because a planner said you should call it that. And that segment is below the headline. Can we go below the headline? Because the headlines are what is confusing the heck out of everybody, because most of us just read the headline, and because of social media, we see the snippet and we think it is what it is. Like you've heard, the UK is now stopping their opening because of the Delta variant. And everybody's now, okay, this Delta variant's going to halt everything what we're doing in the US. And it's like, no, the UK is pausing for 3 weeks because they had a process to say, I'm only going to administer a single dose to more people versus fully vaccinating everybody. So the fully vaccinated people have great efficacy against even the Delta variant. The problem is they didn't double dose everybody. So they're pausing for 3 weeks to catch up on the second dose. And that is just being very prudent. And they're not closing it, they're just slowing it down. That kind of headline is just, it can freeze people in decision-making, specifically in the group market that is looking into the future. But you're making a decision based on what you know now, and that scares a stakeholder to say, well, I'm not going to move forward with that meeting I was just going to place in September or October. So what we ended up doing, we're doing these calls, and We literally have had anywhere between 400 to 600 planners that join us every week for these two calls, and it's engaged. I mean, one of the reasons, again, I was running a few minutes late, the questions that keep coming. And now the questions are about how do we travel? Okay, if I'm traveling to a certain place, am I going to be required to show vaccination? And even if I show that, am I going to still have to be tested coming back? And it's not because they don't want to travel. They're trying to get answers so they can answer to their stakeholders that are coming in as well. So how did we keep a community alive? We did that for our members as well, because we have 300 member hotels. We had a weekly call with those members. And it was something to keep us connected and together. And as an organization and a company, I have had a daily all company call every day since March 16th when we shut the country down. And it has not stopped. And when we did the first one, I said, we're going to continue to do this until we don't. And I don't know when it is, when we're going to stop. It'll be a gut, but as long as everybody still needs it, wants it, and connected, I think that's the important part of it. But that we've tried to be a source of information for our industry, for our clients. And when we don't have the answers, we're like, we'll get back to you. We'll go do the research. We'll do the homework for you. And I think that's the best thing you can do in any business today, is be a resource to people, because there's so much confusion around where do I get the right information and what do I need to know?
Yeah, that's especially resonant on my side as well with the airlines, where rewind to early 2020, when it became apparent just how bad this pandemic was set to be, the first thought for a lot of travelers, oh my gosh, I've got flights in April, in May that I've paid for. What happens now? Like, I'm assuming I can't go. Can I get my money back? What's the process? And for a lot of folks, that confusion, uncertainty was really paramount. This wasn't something that was just discretionary. I mean, we were, worried about there being a worldwide depression happening. And so the cost of the flights for a lot of people wasn't something that was just trivial. They were worried, oh, I might not have a job next week. I need to make sure I'm getting as much money back as possible, and getting what I'm owed. And so that's where we kind of saw the role that we could play as it became clear that travel was not going to be a priority for most folks over at least the next few months. Is, okay, we know a lot about what the kind of rules and regulations are around air travel. For instance, that there's a Department of Transportation regulation that says that if the airline cancels or significantly changes your flight, you are entitled to a cash refund if you want one. We knew that. Our members were excused for not necessarily knowing that, because look, we've all got so many things in our life we are worried about that trying to remember chapter and verse of random Department of Transportation regulations isn't exactly a priority for most folks. And so we saw that as an opportunity. Okay, let's make sure that our members know that when their flight gets canceled, they don't have to take a voucher. They don't have to take a credit. They can ask for that cash refund, because as we like to tell folks, you can't go down to Safeway and pay for your groceries with a $500 Delta gift card. Like, you need cash to do that. And so, helping educate our members not only about what the outlook was, what their rights were, how even if there was a flight that hadn't yet been changed, that was a few months away, that their best strategy was actually to view it as a game of chicken, where if they, whichever party blinked first, that's who ended up having to give the bag to the other party. And so give it time, let the airline hopefully end up canceling that flight or changing it, and you'll be able to get that refund. So from an external standpoint, we viewed our role as really kind of advocating for members and educating, being that resource about what their rights were. And then from an internal standpoint, look, it was a scary, scary time for the travel industry in March 2020, when we had no idea how long this thing was going to last. And so we kind of set about, okay, what is the structure that we can put in place so that we're doing everything we can to avoid the worst possible outcome in our mind, which would be layoffs or pay cuts. What are all the steps we can do to try to avoid having to do that? And, laid out a 6-point plan. Step one, if it came to myself and my business partner, Brian, would cut our salaries to $1. Step two, the leadership team would take up salary cut, all these types of things to demonstrate to the team that we're not viewing them as expendable. We are putting ourselves in front of the line of fire if needed, to try to do everything we can to prevent layoffs or salary cuts. And thankfully, I think by dint of either brand loyalty or by dint of a robust annual subscription model, we are able to pull through the year down only 5%, and we didn't have to do any of the layoffs or salary cuts or anything that we had feared, which is I just as on a human level, feels like such an incredible blessing to not have to have those hard conversations. And now, with things having rebounded very quickly, it's an exciting time again to be in travel.
I saw in the question, they talked about knee jerk, and I think it's important not to knee jerk. We dealt with what we knew. We didn't deal with anything else. And I think that's a problem at times with certain organizations and businesses, that they're trying to, I have a saying, it's an important time to be decisively indecisive, and just know what you know and deal with what you know. And that's what you should be doing. But we're so used to planning for the year and planning out. And it's easy to go to my board and saying in January, I'm giving you a budget, and the forecast I give you that's updated every month is going to matter. This budget's not going to matter because I am guessing, and it is a wild guess. And that's so unusual for most of us in businesses. And I think it's important. That's what causes the knee jerk, instead of saying, I'm really trying to plan over the next 30 to 45 days. That's what we did in the crisis. We're looking well past that. And I see Scott shaking his head. I'm sure he's doing the same, because with us, it was cash flow. How do we keep everybody employed, and how do we keep this going? And I can only do that over 30 and 45 days. And that's the only decisions we can make.
I think that really ties into some of the questions that we're getting in the chat. By all means, keep those coming. These are great questions. And so I think a good follow-on to that came from Peyton. And that is, would like to share more about your internal communications for helping your employees and your partners cope. We talked about emotions, and you didn't have your, try not to have your knee-jerk reactions, but how did you use your internal communications in order to communicate messages effectively, but also keep their emotions in check when there was so much uncertainty? How did you keep your hope alive?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for us was defaulting to over communication. So one of the things, we've been a remote company since day one, and a lot of ways we're very prepared for this past year and a half of everybody going remote. But one of the challenges oftentimes of working remotely is making sure that everybody feels in the loop, that those lines of communication are constantly happening, because you don't have the same sort of, water cooler run-ins that you do in an office. You don't have the same sort of just kind of regular all hands meetings every morning. And so for us, what we realized is, okay, we want to make sure that everybody on the team doesn't feel like there is a sort of absence, a void of communication, because in those voids, then people start to, understandably concoct their own stories about, oh my gosh, I haven't heard anything from leadership in 2 or 3 weeks. It must be really bad. Should I be worried about my job? Are things about to implode? And so we set forth a new process where every single week, someone on leadership team was going to make an announcement, basically give out as much information as we could about where things stood, about what it was looking like. Again, we talked about how we had a 6-point plan about things that we would resort to before considering any layoffs or pay cuts, and talked about where we were in that. Thankfully, we never had to make it past step 1, but indexing to over communication and just constant, whether or not we had things to say or not, actually I think ended up serving us well. And we got a lot of feedback from employees and teammates that they really appreciated that. It's funny because from a leadership perspective, my sense before was like, I didn't want to talk if I didn't have anything to say. I don't know, I guess that's like my Midwestern roots or something, but I realized during the pandemic that for a lot of folks, they wanted to be talked to, they wanted to be communicated with, because it gave a sense of comfort. It gave a sense of like, there's nothing being hidden right now, that they felt in the loop, even when there wasn't a whole lot of new information, still being told, yes, here's what we know, here's our outlook, here's where we think things are going, and here are the steps that we're prepared to take if it doesn't go as well as we do, as we hoped. That level of communication, I think, reassures people that they're not that there aren't things sort of happening behind the scenes that they're not privy to.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same. You know, I told you we had an everyday call for our entire organization. We just had it this morning, and it hasn't stopped. And there is this comfort that Scott talks about, that we're all connected, even when you felt so disconnected. And the funny thing was, we even took it to the nth degree. Is every Friday there was an update from our CFO. They saw our cash flow before my board did. So decisions we were making, we were completely transparent to say, here's where we are. And when we're saying we need to be expenses and over this window, and this is why, everybody could see it. It was very simple. And that made it easy to have a real discussion to say, and, you know, I'm proud to say as well, we didn't lose a single employee. We kept everybody employed, and that was my mission with the board. We did take haircuts, but they were graduated. And graduated haircuts for those that it wouldn't hurt as bad, and for those that it would hurt tremendously because of where they might be on a pay scale, we didn't touch them. And that was very conscious of it. But everybody saw it. And you know how easy that discussion is when you talk about communications? I think we overthink things. And when I'm showing them cash flow, I showed them, here's what happens if we do nothing, because we're basically out of cash in mid-June. And this is right when it started. And I'm like, so at that point, we are 90% labor. I have nothing to do except let people go. No options. But by all of us taking this type of graduated haircut, we literally pushed that out until December, which means it gives us plenty of time to figure out what's going to happen with our hotels, because unfortunately, we're a hotel membership. If all my hotels are closed, which they were, it becomes very problematic. It's not even that I wouldn't get the money. I'm just not getting it now because they didn't even have accounting departments. So I think that kind of transparency is making it easy. And when you talk about communication, we use written communication too much as a crutch. And I think the ability to humanize the communication, to not be afraid of any questions that come at you, and to be able to honestly and openly have that conversation is the environment you need to create. And it's something that it's a silver lining for us. I've had more of because like Scott, we're pretty remote. I mean, all of our people are all over the country for the most part. We have offices in certain pieces of the country, but they're still spread out. The commentary has been, I've never felt as connected to this company as I do today. And you have people that have been with us for 20 years. And the reason is we talk every day. And to Scott's point, I start the call every day, and it's 5 to 10 minutes of things we're hearing. And then it goes around and we celebrate quick wins, and we celebrate everybody, any celebrations, birthdays, anniversaries, whatever that is. They started their own thing. It organically grew into a Friday close. That it was inspirational. We got to learn about our team members, and something they wanted to share, and they had to throw it to somebody else for the next Friday. And it just kind of continued. And that, I think, was important. And it was organic. I think it's really important is we didn't try to force it. What we did was create the forum or the platform to be able to bring people together and start to have a dialogue. And you realize that there was comfort with that. And I think it was important for me as CEO to consistently relay a message. At certain times you felt it and saw it. I have salespeople, when they're not selling, they get anxious. And I used to have to tell them, I have zero expectations on what your production is going to look like. The only thing I'm asking you to do is stay in contact with our clients, see how they're doing. Stay in contact with our members, see how they're doing. Stay in contact with each other to see how we're doing. Let's be there for our customers. Let's be there for each other. But you would hear, and I'd get notes later, that me telling them, I have zero expectations about the number. So don't put that pressure on yourself. This is what we're expecting you to do. I think that's where the communication changes, because we sometimes don't say, I know this is your job, but for the next 9 months, it's not going to look anything like that. So this is what we need to focus on.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I just want to add one very brief thing. There's this notion that we've grappled with for a while of transparency, where we try to be as transparent as possible with our employees. And the way that we had defaulted to transparency before the pandemic was to basically put all the information about our internal metrics and financials and everything on an internal company page and say, here's the page, you can go check it anytime. what we realized coming into the pandemic and throughout was that the way people resonated with transparency wasn't just that they had access to the information. It was oftentimes the impetus of, is the impetus on the employee to go find the information, or is the impetus on us to bring the information to folks, to communicate it with them in a way that's resonant and interesting and engaging with them? And in both ways, the information is accessible, but by bringing it to folks and saying, weekly announcement, here's where we're at, XYZ, rather than it saying, well, there's this website over here, you can check it at any time you want, ended up really being a surprising morale boost that I would not have expected, because I came in with that mindset. Transparency is transparency. You can see it anytime, but for folks, having it brought to them and feeling, communicated with on their level ended up being really kind of paying dividends.
Yeah, and Scott, you bring up something important, because I think even for organizations that try to be transparent, the issue in communication, too many organizations are giving information instead of context. We're not explaining the why. And that this opportunity during this pandemic, we had an opportunity every day to explain the why, not the what. And there's too many organizations I know, it's like, we're transparent. No, all you've done is share data. And all you've done is share the what. You're not transparent until you start explaining the why. Let me explain to you the why of what we're doing and how it impacts you. Those are the two pieces that get lost in Scott's point of, you have to go to a website. You're not talking about that. And this allows you to really have an explanation. And most people aren't comfortable with it because you may be challenged. You may be challenged about your why. And if you're really going to be transparent as an organization, it's okay. You should be challenged about your why. And if you can't defend it, change your why, because it's probably wrong.
I think those are two really, great testaments to the success and the care and the true transparency that you had both through your organizations and your customers. I think those are great lessons to remind our audience and anyone else who sees this later, is to remember the what and the why and the context for your messaging. And so for internal, external audiences, it's a critical fundamental for communications across the board. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about, you talked about the positive changes that you saw in your internal culture sort of resulting organically from this. And that brings me to a question we got from Lauren in the chat. And what do you think is the biggest aspect that has permanently changed in the travel industry as a result of the pandemic? Positive or negative?
I'll go back to something I've said, and it's something I'm pushing with the industry. We should not overthink yet and overplay what is permanently changed for the industry. If I hear the new normal one more time, I swear my head's going to pop.
We are all sick of it, Michael.
We have a new normal every 90 days because of the way technology moves in our world. It's just the world's going to move. And here's one highlight. You know what's going to change forever? We're cleaning with new products and some new protocols that are going to be good for everybody. The fact that we're using, literally microstatic foggers in rooms and on airplanes and in movie theaters, that's good. And I think it's going to make our flu seasons maybe a little less impactful. And the fact that people may actually wash their hands. And I said, I used to do it before it was trendy, but now that it's trendy and everybody's washing their hands, that'll be good for a flu season. I really do think it's an oversight. And the only comparison I can give people that is a true reference, I'm old enough that I was in my business career when the towers came down in New York, and it shut down every airplane. It shut down hotels. It was a demand shock like we had never seen up until that time. 2009 beat that, but at that time, it was the demand shock for our industry. And you know what we all said and truly believed? This is going to change our industry forever. And the only thing that's changed 2 decades later is my TSA process at an airport. Nothing else has changed. The human dynamic hasn't changed. How we travel, that didn't change. And if there's any positive that comes out of this, there is such a need for human engagement that we are not wired to be socially distant. It is not who we are as human beings, that the need for travel, the need for engagement, we're seeing it everywhere that's opening. As soon as people are vaccinated, it's exploding. We had 2 million people through TSA throughput 2 days ago. On good weeks, we used to have 2.2 to 2.5. And that's without business travel being fully back yet. That is telling us, and leisure's through the roof, by the way. Leisure business in hotels is back to 2019 levels already. And if there's a silver lining, I think it's going to remind everybody, if anything, you probably don't appreciate something truly until it's taken away from you. And our ability to connect, with other human beings, and our ability to explore and see the world, it was taken away. And I think people really struggled with their own mortality, knowing that life is short. And through all of that, I think people are going to be checking a lot of boxes to say, those places I wanted to travel and I haven't been able to, I have found every excuse not to, I'm going to quit finding excuses and we're going to go. To me, those are the things, but I can't stress enough, we should not overthink what's permanent until, I always say, give it 18 months for the dust to settle. And then we'll find out if there are real permanent changes outside of that.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. That I think it's easy to overstate in the moment what any permanent changes are going to be, because look, the reason why dynamics exist in the first place is, especially in travel. I mean, travel is such a fundamental human experience. There's a reason why it's the most popular New Year's, New Year's resolution every year. It's the reason why it's one of the most things that when folks are getting older, they look back on and wish they had done more of, or glad that they did as much as they did of. It's an incredibly rich and powerful experience, and that I think is going to be really resilient coming out of this. Now, I think there are going to be a few marginal changes, but I would really kind of classify them more as accelerations of already existing trends. So, you saw a bunch of older airplanes start to get retired in an accelerated timeline throughout the pandemic, and more newer planes start to become more larger proportions of an airline's fleet. You see certain routes that, before the pandemic, there may be some routes that had been not the most profitable or this or that, but like inertia and status quo are powerful forces. But all of a sudden, when everything gets wiped out and you're starting from scratch as an airline, creating a new route network, you don't have the same sort of vested interest that when you're starting from zero. It's a lot easier to create a much more kind of dynamic and profitable route map. The biggest change from a sort of traveler experience that I'd say is the airlines quietly late last fall getting rid of change fees. So for time immemorial, for the past 40 years, one of the fundamental aspects of buying a flight was that once you purchased your ticket, your dates were pretty well locked in. And if you wanted to change your flight dates, you had to pay an arm and a leg. I mean, we're talking $200, $300, $400, $500 just to change your dates, plus any fare difference. What the airlines realized last fall was that for the foreseeable future, tourism and leisure travelers were going to be the ball game. Business travel is going to be much slower to recover, and so if they wanted to survive these next few years, they were going to have to do everything they can to appeal to leisure travelers, to win over vacationers. And a big thing that vacationers demanded was flexibility, being able to make their plans in pencil rather than in pen. And so what the airlines did is they got rid of those change fees, in their words, permanently. They say now if you book a flight, you can change your dates later on without having to pay any penalty to do so. If your new dates are more expensive, you have to cover that fare difference. But if your new dates are cheaper, you'll actually get the difference back in the form of a travel credit. So all the more reason to be prioritizing cheap flights. The exception there is with basic economy fares, but this is again a long-term trend that is getting accelerated, where the airlines are trying to really kind of differentiate the basic economy fare from their sort of higher tier fares from main economy. And now main economy has another privilege, another thing to try to entice folks to buy up to a slightly more expensive ticket.
What about the sort of maybe more sudden emergence of a work from anywhere type of a culture? That's sort of like a new segment that perhaps both of you have been seeing any kind of uptick in.
I'll say really briefly, because I'd love to get Michael's perspective here. My sense is that I don't know yet how that is going to play out from a business travel perspective, because that's the biggest question: is how will this impact business travel? And the reason why Michael and I keep harping on business travel is something that is fundamental to the airlines financials. I assume to hotels financials as well, because airlines make a disproportionate amount of their revenue from business travelers who tend to pay higher, buy more expensive flights, pay higher fares than your leisure travelers who just really care about what is the price of the flight cost. And so will work from home, will work from anywhere result in less business travel because there are fewer offices? Will it result in more business travel because, when you have folks remote, you want to find opportunities to bring folks together? I don't know. I don't have a strong outlook on this one way or another. I'll be very keen and curious to see, but this is actually one area where I don't have a fully kind of like fleshed out sense of how this trend will play out over the next couple of years. What's your sense, Michael?
Yeah, I can tell you that the narrative of the work from home, that we are going to be in a society of work from home because of this, is well overplayed. The research that is coming out, I'm not saying that as opinion, the research that is coming out and people tend to ignore it because our mainstream media for some reason doesn't report it. I was just in New York on Monday night, the financial district downtown. We're at a restaurant. It's jam-packed. And I asked, what's going on? Goldman Sachs ordered 10,000 people back to the office June 14th. And it was really simple. If you want to work for us, you will be back in the office on June 14th. If you don't, you can leave, but you will be back in the office. JP Morgan did the same thing. Louis Vuitton did the same thing. Cisco Technologies, moving everybody back. Under the radar, Google is expecting everybody back by September 1st, plus anybody expecting to work from home more than 2 weeks in 22 total, they have to write in for written permission to say, why is it important? Why is it necessary for you to do that? Culture adhesion is so critical to these organizations. And what got lost when they said we could do the work remotely, what got lost is that doesn't mean it was effective for an organization and culture. We did it because we had to, not because it was the most ideal. Now, when I say that, there's a caveat. I do believe the 9 to 5, 5 days a week is gone. You're going to have the flexibility that you could work from home on a Friday, but you're going to be in the office 3 to 4 days a week. And I think what organizations will do is clearly define what those expectations are. The days that we're going to expect you to be here together and the days we're not. And there's an important lesson to this because it's not any one, the financials have been really aggressive, but I can tell you, in my past life, I used to be able to do these executive days with these major companies. And it was Cisco that we were in their offices and they were kind of going through all the different departments, and HR came in and they told us, we have trouble keeping young employees. And they go, do you know why? And I said, because you're not cool enough. And they said, and I was being serious, all around you is Google and Facebook and Apple. And they're like, we thought the same thing. We did exit interviews. We were losing young, and they say young talent, it's within 5 years of working with them. They were losing those people because they came to get access to senior workers and senior leadership, and they had zero access because they were remote. And it is that opportunity to be in a classroom, to be engaged. We talk about human connection, and then we keep talking about people are going to work remote. It's not going to last long term. I think the flexibility is going to change. And when I say we ignore things, the head of Cushman & Wakefield, it's one of the largest commercial real estate operators in the world. He was on CNBC and he said, in the areas of the world that they have opened up already, i.e. Australia, they're at 99% of their occupancy that they had in 19. They are back as soon as you got it open. And if you look at the office space that was bought during this time frame, it was Google, it was Apple, it was Amazon that bought the most square footage of office space because they're going to put people in it. And I just think this narrative is misplaced. And then most importantly, the work from home study that was done by Gensler, less than 12% of workers want to work from home full time, less than 12%. And that gives me great optimism because that makes sense. I mean, the people that are working from home, hasn't been the most glorious experience. And we found, Chuck Robbins said this with Cisco, that they started to see mental health issues with their employees because they've been isolated at home so consistently. And, you think about some of these younger workers, they're in a 600 square foot apartment. And that's what you're working in. For people that have homes and, I got my office, that's different. But that's not the experience of your traditional workforce. And I think it's overplayed. You're hearing a lot about a hub and spoke. where you're going to be coming to the mothership quite often, and there's going to be an expectation, and then we'll have certain jobs and certain priorities remote. I can tell you, financial in New York, they're demanding them. They're demanding it that you're coming back, and it's not an option. It's bringing them back. And when you have J.P. Morgan and Goldman and those guys, it starts to put peer pressure on everybody else, and that is the beauty of it coming. That I do think, and that's why I say let's not overstate where we think the world's going to end up. Let's give it 18 months and settle down. And will there be a little bit of a larger portion? Yeah, the percentage is going to grow, but I don't think it's going to be everybody's at home or most of the people are at home and we have very few people in the office. It's just not the case. And we're not seeing it anywhere in the data and the research, but unfortunately, the narrative isn't stating that right now, which is really frustrating for me because if I have any frustration through all of this, it's been the media. The mainstream media, and I call them media because they're no longer journalists. Journalists used to report the news versus an opinion on it. And we're lacking a lot of that in the world today. And there was a study, by the way, I'd be remiss if I didn't say it, a Dartmouth professor around COVID thought everything was so negative. They did a whole AI analysis and it was reported in the New York Times. And this AI analysis showed you that the mainstream media in the US, and it didn't matter which letters you had, CNN or MSNBC or Fox, the mainstream media was 90% negative on COVID. Your local regional news was about 65%, and international was 45%. So the international had the most balanced approach to everything that was going on because there was some good news inside all that bad news. And what they explained was like, we were surging. Okay, yeah, you're surging and that's bad news. As we were declining, the mainstream media would tell you where we're still surging, not that we were declining in the US. And that was kind of the focus. And I say that because there's this narrative right now, and I think it's very centralized to the people where the news comes from. It is the West Coast and East Coast, and it's New York and LA that drive that narrative. And then you have a very different narrative around the country. And I think somewhere we're going to balance through that. But that's what we're seeing in the data. And that's not opinion. I'm a very data-focused individual. The data is telling us this. If you just listen to the people that actually deal in real estate, they're telling you, they have more space being used, not less, when it's all said and done.
So basically, it's two things. Don't believe the hype. Look at what's going on around you. And also, the more things seem to change, the more they actually stay the same, meaning that we all still crave that human connection. And also, we got a great comment in the chat that says, agree 100%. Working from home as a mid-level professional has been challenging and not ideal. The human connection and water cooler chats are irreplaceable. And I think that that's one thing that people were craving was that connection with your employees. Now, Scott, you're a fully remote workforce, but you've probably been able to keep it all together very well virtually because you were already set up that way.
Remote work is one of those fascinating things where it's not for everybody, and anybody who tells you it's a panacea or anybody who tells you, oh, it's completely untenable, I think is not necessarily doing a good service. It has its challenges and it has its benefits, just like office work. And I'm somebody who, in my former career as a journalist, worked in an office. I'd work out on the road, and now I work fully remote from home. And so I've had experience with all three. And the thing, like, if I were to say the benefits that we find with it on a company-wide, you get the time that you get to save from not commuting, the extra time that you get to spend with your family, whether it's the time that's saved from commuting or just, pop down for some coffee and see my 2-year-old daughter. Oh, hey, how you doing? Like it's those little kind of moments that are great, but you also miss out on that those kind of water cooler chat interactions, those sort of serendipitous run-ins that end up leading to something really beneficial. And so I think a lot of the trying to find the good balance in remote work is trying to account for the drawbacks of it. So whether that's having, we do quarterly leadership retreats once every 3 months. We're just going on ours next week to make sure that we have those relationships built and strengthened, that we do annual, full team retreats where we get to take a big vacation together, going down to Cabo later this year as an entire team together, because we want to make sure that the online relationships are built from an offline basis, that it's a lot easier to assume the best of something. There's a lot when it's typed in Slack or email or whatever that can be read a little bit ambiguously. And when it's built on a personal relationship, when you've had a beer with this person, you've shared dinner with this person, you're much more likely to view whatever they write generously and assume the best, rather than if they're just dots on a screen to you, you might, be defaulting to assuming the worst in those ambiguous situations. So I think it's a blend of trying to account for the drawbacks of remote work with those in-person meetups. The one benefit that I find with it, from a company level, and why I'm actually thrilled to see so many other companies go back to fully in-office work, is that there are a certain number, Michael mentioned the 12% of folks who really kind of prefer to work from home. I mean, that's a non-trivial number of people. We're talking tens of millions of people around the country. And, you think of that superstar computer engineer in upstate New York, that great creative design worker in Fargo, North Dakota, who doesn't necessarily have a rock star company be able to work for in person, but being able to compete for that talent because you offer a remote work for years for us was a real competitive advantage, and became a little bit more challenging now, because when they could apply not just to Scottish Chief Flights, but they could apply to Google or Facebook or Apple or wherever, because everybody was doing remote. That made hiring a little bit more challenging over the past 3-6 months. So it definitely has its pluses and minuses.
Yeah, and it's that not overthinking. No, I mean, Shay, it's exactly what Scott said. That's what I mean by not overthinking it, because he's exactly right. There's tens of millions of people that are going to work remote, and many have. I mean, most people couldn't tell you, was that 12%, 8% before this started. Yeah, there was already a percentage there, and then I reverse it to the other side. So you have tens of millions of people that want to work from home. You have hundreds of millions of people that are going back to the office. And even if that number moves a little bit, it's still in the hundreds of millions of people that are going back to the office. That ties back to that business travel side of it. And I do think, even if we get more remote, to Scott's point, you're going to have to bring them together more often for that cultural adhesion that you're looking for. And Scott, I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you, we have great hotels in Cabo, so just let us know and we can help.
As we're all about here at IABC, making good connections. We have 8 minutes left before we finish up. And so if you want to ask a question, please drop it in the chat so we can make some time for you. And here is one question I wanted to get to here from a communications perspective. How do you balance companies, and specifically cruises, needing to manage the safety of their passengers and requiring proofs of vaccinations, even though I think that's been rescinded for some, at least the ones coming out of Galveston. And how do you balance that with states like Florida and Texas that are passing legislation that businesses cannot ask for those vaccine passports?
I can tell you right now, you can't. What you're seeing is you have cruise lines saying, okay, we're not going to go out of those ports, and we're going to have to go out of other ports because the state's not going to allow for it. And the issue is, it's not necessarily that the cruise lines are emphatically wanting to make sure vaccinations are the movement. It's the CDC requiring that for them to even sell. And there's other battles going on. And I should have mentioned this. I'm on the U.S. Travel Association's executive committee, and these discussions are hot and heavy because the cruise line industry, unfortunately, has been treated differently by the CDC than any other part of our country. It's not required when you go to a hotel. It's not required when you go to a restaurant. It's not required if you go to a movie. It's not required when you go to the grocery store. But
not required on an airplane.
No, you go on an airplane sitting 3 inches from somebody, and it's not required. And yet the cruise lines are being required to have that to even sell and to even operate. And there's a bigger battle because, unfortunately, the politicizing of it is, oh, it's Texas and Florida. While the reality of it is the CDC has put a guideline in that is completely different for the cruise lines than any other part of our industry, and nobody can explain why. Why is it so different? That's an interesting one that I don't know how to resolve it. It's not going to be, it'll be resolved in the courts. It's not going to be resolved anywhere else.
And that's something that we're not hearing as well. You just hear all this, buzz about, vaccine passports and, again, all the things that are being hyped. I would say that that's really an interesting insight that I don't think a lot of us have heard. We have
Well,
another question. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say there's going to be lawsuits, and when the lawsuits come, it'll be interesting because you restricting somebody to travel, for instance, on a cruise because of you're either vaccinated or not vaccinated, you're now getting into ADA law because the American Disabilities Act is saying you're now discriminating against me. I may have a medical condition that keeps me from actually taking the vaccine, and I can't do something now because of it. That's against the American Disabilities Act. You haven't even gotten into the constitutional law of people that actually have a religious objection to vaccines for a variety of reasons. It's protected by our Constitution. Those lawsuits haven't picked up yet. And to say you can go if you have it, but then if you don't, you have to test, that's not restricting somebody. But to say you can only go if you're vaccinated, that's now restricting somebody from an activity because of for one reason or another. It's going to get interesting when it's all said and done. And you know what nobody mentions? The actual vaccines that are being administered are not FDA approved. They are approved for emergency use. They are not an FDA approved drug yet. And yet you're trying to force people to do that. It's an interesting dynamic right now. I don't have the answers. It's just interesting.
It's extremely complicated, without a doubt. So we do have another question from Brittany. How is the hotel industry overcoming the staffing shortages now that things are moving back to quote unquote normal?
We're not. And the staffing issues are complex. There are three components in it. And I'll tell you, first component, and it is 25 states have removed the extra unemployment benefit, the extra $300 that was being applied, even though it was in the stimulus bill, federally, they were just refunding it to the states. The states actually pay it. 25 states have already removed it. And yes, I can tell you, I've been traveling. I've traveled 46 times since July, visiting our hotel, now what's going on. And they all say the same thing. I'm talking to employees that are telling you, I'd be taking a pay cut coming back to work because of the extra benefits. And I always say it's an unintended consequence of a bill that we were trying to do the right thing. That's getting the politics out of it. So then the other part of it is then we have this issue with a lot of the states that had not opened and been really restrictive. They hadn't opened schools, which means daycares were still closed. These people need childcare. And that is an issue. And that should probably resolve itself by September. And then the last piece of this is we depend on seasonal labor from international destinations on H-2B visas. One, those have been capped and actually shrunk over the last couple of years. And on top of it, they can't get here because of COVID restrictions. Some of that traffic's from Europe. Some of that traffic's from South America. And we depend on them to seasonally help us when we surge in the summer in our summer resorts and then bring it back down and I have my normal staffing. So it's not as simple as we're just looking for labor. Again, the narrative hasn't been complete. There's like three pieces of this that are very complex.
We have another question for you both. I'd like to start with you, Scott. Could you share how your business had to evolve in terms of service models and offerings? I know when we talked earlier, you had to change a little bit of what you were doing for your subscribers.
Yeah, that's right. So coming into the pandemic, the service that we offered was almost entirely focused on international flights. And the reason why is that's where you save the most money when those $130 Milan flights popped up. I mean, what we realized pretty quickly early on in the pandemic was that to the extent travel was going to be existing for the foreseeable future, it was going to be domestic focused, that overseas travel just wasn't going to be possible. And if it was possible, it wasn't going to be in demand for quite a while. And so it was an all hands on deck effort to really kind of pivot, start to reorganize and make sure that we could roll out within, I think, 2 months of when we made the decision in April. We've got to offer domestic flights. We've got to meet our members where they are. You know, we talked about pivoting or I love that announcement. What is a step ball change? Not like there was some discussion internal. Should we do a full-on pivot? Should we go away from flights and towards, road trips, RVs, the types of thing? I'm glad that we resisted the temptation to do a full pivot and instead just sort of did a reorientation because domestic flights are incredibly popular now, even when you're not saving, $600 on the flights like you are with those cheap Milan deals, those cheap Japan deals. You still want to get the best deal possible. you still don't want to have to overpay for your flight, whether it's domestic or international. And this is where, demand to the extent it existed was. So it was offering domestic flights, and then offering, we started doing a weekly advice newsletter to make sure that, so this is twofold. One, to be able to give that advice, that education, those resources to members who, maybe were holding tickets that they didn't want, and they wanted to get a refund for, how to think about international travel going forward, when things would start to open up, other sorts of just little kind of tidbits of advice that I've learned over the years on how to get good deals, how to not overpay, and then be able to communicate that to members. So, having that and then that be ad supported were two things that we kind of pivoted to early in the pandemic that sort of helped us get through this past year. And now, with travel picking up, it's off to the races. But how about you, Michael?
The biggest thing we did is we started to look at additions where we knew there would be growth, and we've added global sales members into specialty markets, and it wasn't because of the pandemic, but I do think the pandemic allowed us to really evaluate where we saw opportunities moving forward. And with that, we've added staffing. Haven't dramatically changed the modeling, knowing that business is coming back, but what we did was prepare ourselves to be able to capitalize on the momentum when it does. And that was literally building out our comm structure, our marketing structure, being able to make sure our data stack looked right as far as how we're going to be able to really get some business intelligence as we move forward to make sure that's accurate. So we've spent a lot of time, as we keep talking about data hygiene, is really making sure that our system was clean and making sure while we had a little bit of time, that was the focus.
Well, we are at the top of the hour, and so our time is coming to a very quick close. It's the fastest hour we ever have here is our IABC webinars. But I wanted to give you both a quick chance to let everyone know how to get in touch with you. And also, Scott, I understand you have a new book that has just hit the bestseller list.
That's right. Take More Vacations, How to Search Better, Book Cheaper, and Travel the World. My debut book, taking everything I know about finding cheap flights and why they're even more life-changing than we had thought, available at local bookstores, available audiobook and ebook. Yeah. And then if you're interested in cheap flights, would be our honor to send you deals out of your home airport, scottscheapflights.com. No apostrophes, no spaces, no dashes, just scottscheapflights.com.
Awesome. And I just put my email address in the chat, and it's mdominguez@alhi.com, and feel free to reach out. I'm happy to continue the discussion.
Well, we want to thank you both. We want to thank all of you for who have dialed in to hear this, and also those of you who are listening to this recording at a later time. I know summer travel is on everyone's mind right now. We've been cooped up for over a year and we're ready to roll. So again, on behalf of IABC Houston, thank you so much to Scott, Michael, and our board and everybody else who has made this webinar possible. We're also a subscription-based membership here. So if you're not on our email list, please subscribe and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and LinkedIn. Also, you can find us on LinkedIn as well. So again, thank you. I hope you all have a wonderful summer. Stay tuned for future programming that is going to be announced by IABC. And also, don't forget to join us.